Bella.
Carlisle's voice from behind me violently ripped me away from mine and Edward's locked stare. I gratefully turned to where he stood just beyond the doorway, in the hall. He was looking over my shoulder at Edward, then darting his eyes back to mine.
We have a matter to attend to,
he stated tightly, his blue eyes firm and unrelenting. Because he knew that it was time for my medication, and he probably figured I really needed it. Unbelievable. I tried to raise my chin in some kind of show of defiance, but failed miserably as it quivered. "It can wait," I whispered as more of a plea than a demand. Slowly, Carlisle shook his head in objection.
If you get it out of the way now, you can have all evening.
He reasoned in a soft and coaxing voice. Attempting to pacify me, I swiveled my head, to see Edward out of the corner of my eye, pulling on a shirt, and I swallowed an anxiety over just leaving.
He's not going anywhere, Bella,
Carlisle soothed, correctly reading my hesitation. Defeated, I exited the room, scooting past Carlisle, and descending the steps, as they had a brief exchange of glances, that I was all too curious about. Carlisle trailed behind me as I entered the study, and went straight for the little clear cup and bottle of water on his desk. Esme had disappeared, and I wondered how long it would take for her to become meddlesome about all of this. I tossed back the little cup and swallowed the medication as Carlisle rounded the desk, and sat in his chair. I knew better than to think he'd simply let me leave.
Have a seat and relax for a minute,
he pleaded softly as my hand shook the bottle of water ferociously. I snorted, and it emerged as a whimper as my eyes went to the slightly agape door. But my chest hurt far too much for my liking. I needed to breathe and think, and center myself, before I could even begin considering approaching Edward. I went to the sofa and sank into its comforting leather. I laid my head back and closed my eyes, going through the various Carmen-recommended visualizations that were meant to relax me. Carlisle remained silent and still as I battled to calm my racing heart and irrational emotions. All this time he'd been gone, the memory of his effect on me had seemed abstract and remote, but it all felt perfectly familiar now. I tried to trap the portions of my instincts that yelled and jumped and told me to go to him right that second. I locked them away, and they rattled their cages, fierce and feral in their need for his electric hum. It was unhealthy. I could see this now. Before Edward's departure, I would have jumped in that bed with him and let my instincts and emotions consume me now. The concept seemed utterly appalling. It would fulfill my body and perhaps even my heart, but certainly not my mind or conscience. I realized now how important they were. I allowed myself a short moment of pride for becoming a semi-rational individual even where Edward was concerned, even when it felt impossible. I'm not certain how long I sat with my eyes closed, but it must have been a good while. Gradually, my chest began feeling lighter, the pressure decreasing to a bearable throb, and I remained still as I felt my breathing and pulse steady. When I opened my eyes, the darkness outside the windows surprised me, as did Esme's unannounced presence beside Carlisle. I wasn't in as much of a hurry, and though the cages still rattled, I was in a better position to confront them. I sighed, and straightened in my position as I met their concerned gazes. "I feel better," I informed them, suddenly exhausted, as my cheeks flushed in embarrassment. "I don't know what came over me," I lied. I knew exactly what came over me, and their skeptical expressions made it clear that they weren't buying it either. Esme's face transformed into a grimace, her eyes flickering nervously to the door. "You should stay a little longer, Bella," she whispered. "Let the meddling begin." Carlisle's expression was controlled, but his sideways glance at his partner gave away his worry. I think Esme had probably been a little jealous of mine and Carlisle's relationship over the months, and I felt minutely guilty for it. I'd pushed her away, argued with her frequently, and chose to embrace his compassion instead of hers. Few things could have driven her crazier, one of them being upstairs at that very second. But it wasn't about her, and it wasn't about Carlisle or Carmen or Alice or Emmett, or even Edward. This was about me, and nothing could have stopped me from rising from the sofa and exiting the room. If anyone asked, I couldn't say exactly why my next reaction occurred as I opened the bedroom door and spotted him on the edge of the bed. It was a complete 360 to what I'd felt the first moment I'd seen him: desperate, longing, impatient, and rabid. Now, he's staring back at me and looking concerned and loving, rising from the bed and stepping towards me now. The electricity buzzes, but feels almost too tangible as my traitorous fingertips squirm and twitch for contact. Now, I wonder why he's returned, and what he could possibly expect from me now. I feel enslaved by my desire and reactions, and terrified of ever surrendering to them again. Now, I'm downright furious that he's given me these things and taken them away. "Get out," I growled. He froze, mid-step, his expression contorting to one of pain.
Bella, let me.
"Get out," I repeated, my hands trembling again. Not in weakness this time, but in useless strength. The entire scene felt all too familiar of our final altercation, and it made my fury swell. "This is my room, and I want you out. Now." My voice shook as I traveled to the dresser and pulled open drawers, flinging his clothing at him as he stood in the middle of the room, frozen and aghast. His hands were barely extended as they absently caught the clothing I flung at him.
"Can't you just let me talk?"
he asked in a frustrated voice that forced me to halt my actions. I spun to face him, and my furious mind was pleased by the expression of utter panic that replaced the frustration I'd heard. "You've had almost 5 months to talk," I snarled, and tossed the last piece of clothing at his face. Admittedly, it would have made sense for me to at least hear what he wanted if he wanted me, but the segment of my mind that was kept for protecting me was terrified of finding out. My anger wasn't empowering like it should have been. It was entirely hollow and systematic. His jaw was taut, shoulders rigid, as he broke my heated gaze and stared at his hands full of shirts and boxers dismally. I just wanted to, but my mind didn't want to know, so it went on the offensive. Returned for a repeat performance of "fuck" and "duck." I spat, my heart weighing heavily with my words that I knew to be a low blow, but not really caring. He'd already taken his share of his low blows at me. It only seemed fair. Edward's head snapped up, and the expression on his face was simultaneously relieving and staggering. His wide eyes and paled face only amplified the gape of his parted lips, and the realization that he hadn't been expecting my reaction. I took his moment of horrified astonishment to pull open another drawer. Since he wasn't making any move to leave, I walked across the room, choosing a wide path from the edges of his electric hump, and darted to the guest bedroom that Alice had vacated weeks ago. I shoved the clothing through the door, without even bothering to enter, and returned to the drawers, gathering more clothing and heaving hard breaths. Edward remained frozen and stunned as I made the second trip, and grew angered that I couldn't empty his closet too. By the fourth trip, Edward was slowly breaking from his unmoving pose, and followed me into the hallway as I pitched my final armful of clothing through the door, and slammed it shut behind me. I turned to him, and we stood in the hall, me puffing and trembling with empty fury, and Edward wearing that same expression of sheer panic that confused me. I wondered if he were expecting me to hit him again, or something. His panic was perplexing. Truthfully, hitting him seemed senseless and unfulfilling, and I damned his heartbroken gaze for taking the satisfaction it would have granted me. His gaze never left mine as his arms released the clothing he held, dropping it to the floor with a ruffled thump. His eyes, tormented and frightened, discomforted me.
"God, Bella."
He spoke, desperate and pleading, and began moving closer to me with cautious steps, like that of a predator approaching its skittish prey. I moved back, but hit the door as he approached.
"It wasn't anything like that, you have to believe me."
My body was excited and eager as the edges of his static ensnared me. My heart, reluctant but throbbing, willed him closer. My mind screamed and reeled as he grew close enough for the surrounding air became a full-on buzz that crackled over my skin. My resistance, though painful, could be achieved if he just didn't touch me. I pressed further into the door, and shifted my eyes around the hall, searching for an escape, but only finding Edward's haunting stare.
"Just let me explain,"
he coaxed in his lilting voice, but was betrayed by his own trembling as I recoiled from the comfort his proximity created. He was so close now that I could smell his scent, and count his eyelashes. I could see the scars on his neck and lip that I'd inflicted, and I focused on them to keep me grounded. I shook my head vehemently as he raised his hand and reached out to me. I clenched my eyes shut and resisted the twitch of my fingertips that demanded the sensation of his flesh. All at once, his hand was cupping my cheek and sending bright, viciously soothing sparks reverberating through my body. I gasped and involuntarily melted into his perfect touch, every ounce of anxiety and fury melting into the distance beyond the static. And then his warm cheek was against mine and his body was cradled against me. I felt helpless as the cages rattled and exploded in satisfaction. It was the sweetest torture.
"I'm sorry,"
he whispered against my cheek and stroked my hair. When I was capable of fully feeling my anger once again, I knew it'd be directed at his taking advantage of his effect on me. Bitter, I raised my hands to his shoulders to push him off, but it was weak. I was weak. He made me weak. I loathed it. Warm tears pricked at my eyes again and I was disbelieving as he sighed against me in unconcealed happiness. Happiness. He was happy. My mind kept chanting this fact over and over. I'd spent the last nearly 5 months feeling empty, insignificant, and alone, and now he was feeling happiness. "I've never been so close to hating you," I choked and pushed harder because it was absolute truth. His body stiffened around mine as I attempted to push him away once again, and his contented sighs turned to panic gasps.
"Please,"
he begged, a satisfying sound against my flesh. I pushed harder and his arms encircled me tighter as he repeated his plea with a palpable desperation that might have broken my resolve if I didn't know better. I kept pushing, resisting the sedative consequence of his electric hump as he kept pleading against my cheek and grasping me tighter until he abruptly dropped to his knees. I stared in a stunned astonishment as he buried his face into my stomach and embraced my thighs tightly.
"Please,"
he begged again, burying his face deeper. My arms were limp and uncertain as I gazed down at his head. After a moment, I began feeling the wetness of tears penetrating my shirt and dampening my belly. He wants me. Staring down at his unkempt hair nestled into my stomach was surreal, and I briefly wondered if I weren't imagining this whole thing. He was on his freaking knees, groveling. Surreal would be the understatement of the century. My body, perfectly pleased with his contact, was satisfied. My heart, hearing his pleas and feeling his tears, ached to accept him because he wanted me, and surely nothing else would matter. My mind, watching his show of dramatics, rolled its eyes in exasperation, and was further enraged at his attempts. I pried him loose because of none of those things, however. Carlyle and Esme's eyes met mine as they ascended the staircase with caution, surveying the scene of discarded clothing and Edward's crumpled form as he gripped at his shaggy hair and chanted, "Fuck," to the carpet in a strangled whisper. It was tormenting to know that I'd caused his pain. Bittersweet. I realized they had likely come to assure my well-being after my earlier reaction, but I didn't need it, and my firm gaze darting from them to Edward told them he might if he'd even allow such a thing. I turned and left him in the hall with Esme and Carlyle standing behind him, awkward and uncertain. I entered my bedroom, locked myself inside, and tried not to grieve the loss of the electric fur. My soul outranked my body, heart, and mind, and it was desperate for the peace required to find its own desire. Edward could wait for it to come to its conclusion. He owed me at least that much.
Edward's point of view. God damn it, I cursed again as I watched her door close pitifully, releasing my hair and wiping away my tears. I was so fucking sick and tired of crying. I was so sick and tired of messing everything up. I am so fucking fucked. She hated me. It was even worse than I'd allowed myself to imagine. The fact that Carlisle had accepted me back like the prodigal had given me a false sense of hope that she'd just let me explain it to her and she'd understand. But she didn't, and I wasn't entirely sure if I could blame her. I've